All right, let's do another episode. I think I should have fixed this before I started recording, but Farmstead Extra. Let's see how this works, see how this goes. So, this last Sunday, we talked about guarding our hearts, specifically about worrying about what other people think. And so, let's try to expand on that maybe a little bit. About what other people think and not letting that drive us or dictate who we are, what we believe, why we do the things that we do. Excuse me if I grimace or move. I sneezed this morning and pulled a muscle in my back. That's how you know that you're getting old. So, as we talked about not worrying about what other people think Sunday morning, there were two things at the end that we kind of gave as well, here's some tools, some resources. This is how you to hopefully help us not worry about what other people think. Kind of let this be kind of a guide for us, or a couple of tools for us to use. And so I kind of wanted to look at those a little bit more in depth today as we're talking. And so I didn't have any questions or any kind of follow up, and so I didn't have anything to add to the end of this or the second half. And so this will be all that we look at. And so I kind of want to expound on these 2 points and just kind of maybe flesh them out a little bit. We tried to, they're towards the end of the sermon, so we really only hit them for about 5-6 minutes, I think, combined. And so this way we can kind of look at them and hopefully just talk about the ideas a little bit more. So they were 2 points. So the first was love God more than you love people, and the second was do not unequally yoke yourself with unchristians or non-believers. And so let's just take a minute and look at both of those. So the first was love God more than you love people. So if we're going to make sure that we're not worrying about what other people think about us, and that's not what's driving us. And so what's driving us is to glorify God, to honor Him, to do the things that He would have us to do. One of the things that we need to make sure that we're doing is that God comes first, that we're loving Him more than we're loving other things or other people, that He is sitting on the throne of our hearts, of our life, that He takes priority, that He takes precedence. So the verse that we use or looked at to kind of move us in this direction or talk about this topic, we found in Mark chapter 12, verses 29 through 31. So this is where Jesus is asked, what is the greatest commandment? And here is His response. The most important is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. So we have 2 commandments here. The first is love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And the second is this, love your neighbor as yourself. There's no other commandment greater than these. So these are the 2 greatest commandments. And you see churches embrace this and talk about this, love God, love people. It's common vernacular within Christianity and within the Christian church. And so this is core to what it means to live out our faith. This is, essential to what it means to be a Christian. If you're summing up how to live as a Christian, we understand becoming a Christian is placing your faith and trust in Jesus as Lord and Savior. But how to live out the Christian faith, the easiest way to simplify it, love God, love people. Now, there's a lot of stuff that comes with that. But love God, love people. If you wanted to simplify Christianity or living out your faith, that's how you do it. And so one thing that we pointed out Sunday, just to reiterate, because I don't know if we can reiterate it enough, is Jesus gives this in an order. He doesn't say, hey, the greatest 2 are these, and then just throws them out. He says the first is this, and the second is this. The most important is this, and the second, which is like it, is this. The first is to love God with all of your heart, mind, soul, and strength. The second is to love your neighbor as yourself. Those are given in a very strategic, purposeful way. Love God first, love people second. And man, if we're going to live a life of honoring God, glorifying God, if we're going to live out our faith the way that God has called us to do so, you got to keep this in order. There's no way for this to get out of order and still be the people that God has called us to be and do the things that God has called us to do. God has to take priority. God has to come first. When something else trumps God, when something else becomes more important to us um, than loving God. Maybe it's a family member, maybe it's spouse, maybe it's parents, maybe it's kids, maybe it is job, money, whatever it may be, the approval of others. So if we're going to stick to our theme and our topic, the approval of others or trying to impress other people, then it becomes an idol, and it'll become our driving factor, and it'll become our master, and it will become what we worship. And the Bible is clear that we can serve one master. In Matthew chapter 6, verses 24, Jesus lays out a piece of truth, and then he gives a very specific application for it. But I think that we can apply it a bunch of different ways. So Matthew 6:24 says, "No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." So the truth is, you've only got one master. You can't have two masters. You'll love one, despise the other. The second, or the application is that Jesus used is you can't serve God and money. I think that application can go 100 different ways. You can't serve God and family in the sense of putting family first. You cannot serve God and popularity. You cannot serve God and your job. You cannot, meaning not that our family is bad, not that having a job is bad. We've talked about how it's an essential that we work and we provide for our family, especially for the men in the family, the men in the home. But when it comes to who or what is first and who or what takes priority, who it is that is guiding and dictating and directing everything else that we do, Jesus Christ comes first. So we cannot love God and then love anything else on the same level, the same spot, the same perspective, or not perspective, but the same position as we love God. I love my wife, but I believe that I'm called to love God more than I love my wife. My wife loves me. She is called to love God more than she loves me. I love my children. I love God more than I love my children. Um, I hope my children, as they become believers and as they grow in their faith, three of them are Christians, got one to go. As they grow in their faith, that they love God more than they love me. Now, this is imperative, and I don't want to jump ahead to another way this applies. I kind of want to keep focusing on loving God first. When we shift and we love something else more than we love God, then it's going to impact our faith. It's just going to, because loving God affects how we love people. So if we love God first, and that defines, that shapes how we love people. If we love people first, that's going to affect how we love God. So Jesus said that if we love God, we'll keep his commandments. We'll obey him. He says, we don't love God, we won't keep his commandments. And he said, look, this is from the Father. So take it up with him if you've got issues. And so it's a reminder for us that God has to come first. And if he doesn't, then so let's illustrate this. Let's talk about it like this. Can you think of anyone? And I know people that have been like this who, they grow up and they understand that God has given commandments and expectations, and they have stood on that and said, look, this is what God has said. But then someone that they know, or someone that they love, or someone that they really like, embraces or goes against that commandment. And then all of a sudden their perspective changes. So the greatest way to illustrate this is just with, you don't want, I hate that, it sometimes seems like as Christians, we're constantly beating up on homosexuality. And I get that as our culture has embraced that, accepted it, tells us that we all have to. And so it's important for us to take a stand against it. I also hate that it's become kind of our whipping post almost. But in this illustration, in this point, I think it fits. I think it works. You'll have pastors who, for their whole life, their whole ministry, have said that, look, the Bible says that homosexuality is a sin. And if it's a sin, that's something that we have to stand against. But then they have a grandchild or a child or a nephew or a niece, someone that they really like, someone that they really love, comes out as homosexual. And then all of a sudden, there's this conflict of, do I really believe this? And then sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes you see this transition. Well, maybe homosexuality isn't a sin anymore. Maybe it's really not that big of a deal. Maybe it's not that bad. And what's happened is, instead of loving God, dictating how we love people, meaning we stand for truth, even in grace and love, we stand for truth. It's never loving to encourage someone in their sin. That's not a loving thing, because we understand that sin goes against God. Sin leads to death. Sin destroys not just our relationship with God, but our relationship with people. Sin brings guilt and shame with it. And so it's never loving to encourage someone in their sin. Yet when we love people more than we love God, then it's never okay. In our mind, it's okay to say, well, maybe God doesn't have it right here because I really love Sally, or I really love little Johnny, or I really love my grandchild. I really love my nephew or my niece. And they've, this is who they are. This is how God made them. And so because they've loved people more than they love God, and they get those commandments flip-flop, they get those commandments switched, then it shapes what they believe and it shapes who they are. And so we want to make sure that God comes first. Loving God is priority, because that's going to shape how we love people. It's going to shape how we stand for truth. It's going to shape who we are. And if we get those flipped, then people's feelings, people's preferences, people's thoughts will take precedence over what God has said. It's a scary place to be, to tell God that he got something wrong because somebody that we like doesn't agree with what God has said. It's a scary place to be, to where you are content saying the God of all creation, who is perfect and holy and just in everything that he is and in everything that he does, has gotten things wrong simply because someone that you like disagrees with what God has said. And so I get that's not always the easy thing. I've got 4 kids, and as they grow up, hopefully not, but one of them might make decisions that completely go against God, or they've said, you know what, I don't think God is right in this, or whatever it may be. And I'm going to have to make a decision. Who do I love more, God or my children? Now, that doesn't mean I have to cast my kids out. That doesn't mean I have to shun my kids. It doesn't mean that I say that you're a terrible person, leave me alone, I don't want to interact with you. I'm still commanded to love them, and I still always will love them. But God has to take precedence. God has to take priority. God has to come first. He is preeminent in creation and life. He needs to be preeminent in my life as well. So when we look at the idea of loving God more than love people, that means making sure that God is coming first. But 2, I think it's important for us to remember and know that loving others well requires us to love God first. So loving others well requires us to love God first. So I talked about this a second ago, or we mentioned a second ago. It's never loving to encourage someone in their sin, or say that their sin is okay, their sin is good, that their sin is beneficial, whatever sin that may be. Maybe it is homosexuality. Maybe it is selfishness. Maybe it is pride. Maybe it's gossip. Maybe it is apathy. Maybe it's, you name it, any number of things. It's never loving to say, well, if that's who you are, if that's how you like to live your life, if that's quote unquote how God made you, then you're fine doing that. No, it's not. It's not fine. It's not loving to leave people in sin. Think about it. Sin is so deadly, destructive, anti-God that for God to eradicate sin from the believer's life, it required the sacrifice of God, the second person of the Trinity, Jesus Christ, God in the flesh, stepping down into humanity to live the perfect life, to be the perfect sacrifice, to die on the cross, to rise again, to ascend into heaven, to sit at the right hand of the throne of God. Sin has an immense cost. And for us to look at sin so callously or so short-sighted or so, hey, it's not that big of a deal, it's a huge deal. But to look at it in such a small way as to allow someone to live in their sin, or not to allow, we don't have control to force people to sin or not to sin, but to not encourage them to righteousness, to encourage them into holiness and obedience, and to agree with them on their sin. That is ungodly, and that is unloving, and that is not what God has called us to do or who God has called us to be. And so, as a reminder, or as we kind of talk about loving God more than we love people, what that means is if we're going to love people, to love them well, to love them the best way that we can, I believe that it requires us to love God first. You know, God has called me to love my wife in a certain way. Husbands, love your wife as Christ loved the church. He laid down his life for her. If I'm going to love my wife the best way that I can, that requires a whole lot of self-sacrifice. That requires a whole lot of laying down of myself. That requires a whole lot of putting her first and above myself. And not first above God, but just first before me. When we're looking at priorities, God, spouse, children, church, work, everything else, I believe that I should put a whole lot of people in front of myself. That I should probably be towards the bottom or at the bottom of that list. And so if I'm going to love my wife the way that God has called me to love her, well, guess what? I cannot do that in and of my own power. I cannot do that in and of my own self. I will not do that in and of my own self. My own self is I'm selfish. I want to do what I want to do. I want my preferences met. I want to meet my needs before I meet hers. And so selfishly, or in and of myself, I won't love her the way that God has commanded me to love her. And so if I'm going to love her the way that God has called me to love her, then first I've got to love God. And so if I love God and I see that the commandment comes from him to love her with all of my heart, to love her by laying down my life, and he has set the example and he has set the standard, then that adds a different motivation for me. That adds a different goal. And it also gives a different strength in order to love her the way that God has called me to love her. And so the best way for me to love my wife is not to put her on a pedestal above everything and anything else. The best way for me to love my wife is to make sure that I love God first and that he is the one on that pedestal. And that in turn will help me to love her the way that God has called me to love her, which is a way that is not natural. At least it's not natural for me. And so if I'm going to love my wife the way that God has called me to love her, then I've got to love God first. When we think about this, that loving others requires us to love God's first, I think about the church. You know, the church is many things. It is the gathering of believers. It is a place of encouragement. It is a place of worship. It is a place to be on mission with and for God and doing the things that God has called us to do, and taking the gospel out and doing that together. The church is a family and a relationship that encourages us in our faith. Church is a beautiful, great thing. But the church is also an area to live out this kind of love in very, very real ways. Here's what I mean by that. There is no perfect church. And what I mean by that is there's not a church that you're going to go to where someone potentially is not going to disappoint you, frustrate you, maybe even wrong you or offend you. And so when you go to a church, you have a gathering, whether your church is 30 people, 300 people, 3,000 people. You've got a gathering of 30, 300, or 3,000 imperfect people. Let's assume that they're all Christians. Being a Christian doesn't mean that we're perfect. It doesn't mean that we start to get it all right. We don't make mistakes and we don't mess up. And so when you put two imperfect people, you're going to get imperfection. But when you put 30, 300, 3,000, whatever it may be, people together, our imperfection is going to show. Our imperfection is going to rub up against somebody else's imperfection. And someone's going to get their feelings hurt, or someone's going to get offended, or someone's going to get wrong. And so the church gives us an opportunity not just to worship God, but to also love the way that God has called us to love. So when we get frustrated, when we get upset, when we get wronged, when we get offended, do we respond the way we want to respond? Do we go off? Do we leave? Do we say, well, so-and-so hurt me, so-and-so wronged me, so-and-so, whatever it may be, so I'm going to leave and find another church? Well, you're going to find another church where someone else is probably going to hurt you. Because one, you haven't dealt with that past hurt, but two, you're just going to another place with a bunch of imperfect people. Until we get to heaven, that's the best that we've got. Or do you love the way that God has called us to love, which is forgiving someone, being patient with someone, showing grace towards someone who is walking their own journey with sin and obedience and faith and trusting God and confession and repentance. And so we can't love people, even in the church, the way that God has called us to love people without loving God first. Because forgiveness is probably not our natural response when somebody wrongs us. We want to bow up. We want to get our feelings hurt and let our feelings dictate and drive us. We want to run away and find something new or find something else. And so, look, I'm not saying there's never an opportunity or a reason or a purpose for leaving a church. But if it's because X person offended you, this or that person made you mad, this or that person let you down, that's humanity. Even believers, we're going to let each other down. And so we've got to be gracious with one another. We've got to be patient with one another. We've got to be able and willing to forgive one another. And so we cannot do that in and of our own strength and our own ability. We have to love God first and foremost. And so loving God more than loving people doesn't mean that we don't see the value of people. People are created in God's image. God has called us to love other people. But it means that we put God first. And we understand that if we want to love people the way that God has called us to love people, we have to love Him first. That gives us the strength to love people. It sets the expectation of what love looks like and what love is. And God, in those relationships, in marriage, in friendship, in the church, God gives us those opportunities to love people the way that He has loved us. And that God loved people who had rebelled against Him, who were His enemies. And He sent His Son to die for them, to sacrifice, to show them what love is. And so in our relationships that God has given us, we have the opportunity to love the way that God has loved. But we're never going to do that if we don't love Him first and foremost, above all else. All right. The next tool or whatever else thing to think through as we're looking at making sure that we're keeping God first and we're not striving to love people more than we love God, and we're keeping God first and we're not worrying about what other people think, is that we want to make sure that we do not unequally yoke ourselves with a non-Christian or an unbeliever. So this comes from 2 Corinthians 6, 14 through 15, which says, "Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers, for what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness, or what fellowship has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Belial? Or what portion does a believer share with an unbeliever?" So the idea here is Christians and non-Christians live different lives in the sense of what comes first, what takes priority, what is driving you, what is shaping you, what is deciding who you are and how you live. So Christ for the believer comes first. God takes priority. God takes precedence. God takes first. God shapes who we are and how we live, what is important to us, what is valuable to us, what, um, how we love, what we love. And so for the unbeliever, well, they don't know God. The Bible says that they are still enemies of God until they place their faith and trust in Him. And so they're not going to love God. God is not going to be their priority. Loving Him, following Him, trusting Him, having faith in Him is not going to be what drives them because they don't know Him. They've never trusted in Him. They've not put their faith and trust in Him yet. And so, with that, if you are a Christian and you're striving to love God, you're going this way. If an unbeliever who doesn't know God, they're going this way. Doesn't make them the worst person in the world. It doesn't mean that they are mass murderers or whatever else the case may be. It just means the goal, the focus, the priority, the direction of your life is different. Because one knows God, one does not. One is a child of God, one is not. One has placed their faith and trust in God, one has not. And so the word that Paul used here in 2 Corinthians is yoke. And the idea of the yoke is it was the double hoop or half circle that linked two oxen together. When you had a stronger ox and a not as strong ox or a younger ox. The stronger ox would lead, guide, and direct the younger one, the weaker one, on where to go. Look, there's always going to be times in our life or relationships in our life where we've got people who sometimes we're the stronger, sometimes we're the weaker. And when we're the weaker, definitely, we want to make sure or examine who is it that's leading and directing us? Who is it that's having impact and influence in our life? Who is it that is guiding us, and what direction are they guiding us? Are we moving in the same direction? But also the idea here of unequally yoked is you would never yoke a strong, healthy ox with an ox that is shriveled up and near death. You wouldn't yoke a strong, healthy ox with a donkey or a horse because they're different animals. They have different strides. They have different purposes. They're not the same thing. And so, one, if you're yoked, you're either those animals together. If they're trying to go in a different direction, then they're going to fight, and because they're not moving the same way. They're not going the same direction. If they're that different, then it's going to mess up what they're doing. And so the teaching point that Paul is giving us here is: look, if you're a Christ. What fellowship does light have with darkness? If you're striving to love and follow God with all your heart, and this person that you were yoked together with, they are not, then that relationship is going to cause frustration. That relationship is going to cause difficulty because you're moving in two different directions. And so as Christians, if we want to make sure that we're not worrying about what other people think about us, and that we're keeping God first and foremost above all else, we want to make sure that we are equally yoked, meaning the closest relationships in our life, the ones that are having the most impact in our life, the ones that are influencing us the greatest, that we're like-minded in what's important to us. We are like-minded in what is valuable to us. We are like-minded in the direction that we are going. And so we have to examine the relationships that are in our life. Who are our friends? Who are the people that are influencing us? Who are the people that are shaping us? 1 Corinthians 15:33, do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals or ruins good morals in ESV. People have influence on us. They do. You will not live a life where someone does not influence you in some capacity, either for the good or the bad. We just have to see who it is that's influencing us and what direction they're influencing us. And then we've got to make decisions about those relationships. If someone is influencing us in a way that does not love God, glorify God, move us closer to Him, then that's a relationship that we need to second guess. That's a relationship that we need to sit back and say, is this the relationship that I need in my life? So, what do we do if we find ourselves in one of those relationships? What do you do if you're examining your relationships? And this is something that we didn't have time to do Sunday morning. And you say, you know what? I'm in a relationship where I am unequally yoked. I am bound together with someone who does not love Jesus, someone who has not trusted him, and someone who is not walking with him. How do I handle this? What is my response? And I think it depends on what's the nature of the relationship. So just to run through a couple of illustrations or a couple of ways to kind of look through this, think about this. Biggest relationship is marriage. So let's say you married someone who is not a believer. Maybe at the point of marriage and dating, you were a Christian, they were not. Maybe you were both lost and then you got saved after you got married. What do you do? How do you handle this? If they're not a Christian, does that give you the right to now walk away so that you're not unequally yoked? Jesus said, don't be unequally yoked, or Paul said, don't be unequally yoked, and now you're unequally yoked. Does that give you the right to leave your marriage so that you're not unequally yoked? No. And we know this because Paul, again, answers this question in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So Paul is talking to people who were not Christians, and all of a sudden the gospel comes to Corinth, and these people become Christians. And so sometimes they become Christians and their spouse doesn't. So Paul's talking about relationships, and he gives us the answer to this. So let me read 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 12 through 16. It says this: To the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. So if you're married to an unbeliever, and they're not leaving, and they are fine staying with you, even though you're a Christian and they're not, stay with them. Don't divorce, don't leave, don't move on. Verse 14. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. So what does that mean? Does that mean the husband is saved because his wife is saved, or the wife is saved because her husband is saved? No. It's talking about influence. So if a godly husband or wife is married to someone who does not know Christ, then the one who does not know Christ is being influenced and impacted daily by someone who knows and loves Jesus. So one, that means they're hearing the gospel, and God has the opportunity to work in their life. Seeds are planted, seeds are watered. Hopefully seed will grow to fruit one day. But there's that impact of influence by the gospel. There's also the reality of the believer can act almost as a stop or a caution for the unbeliever going into more sin. So let's just throw out alcohol as an example. So let's say the unbelieving spouse, if left to themselves, they would, or married to an unbeliever, they would spend a lot of time at a bar or drinking socially. Maybe they would drive drunk. Maybe they sometimes become addicted. But let's say they're married to a believer who chooses not to drink. Well, that's going to hopefully impact them and cause them not to drink as much. And it's going to limit the sin of drunkenness in their life because of that relationship that they have with their spouse. And so the believing spouse doesn't transport salvation onto them, but they have an impact and an influence, and even their righteousness and their desire to love God and follow God can keep the unbeliever going as sinful as maybe as they would have gone. Same with the kid. It says, otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. Having that influence with your children gives them opportunities to hear the gospel, to see the Christian life lived out. You know, we've talked about this and used this as an illustration. If you are a Christian and you have children and your children are in church and you are doing some measure of, even if it's once a week or it's just once a month, whatever it is, Bible study or devotion in your home, then weekly your child should be hearing the gospel. Weekly, your child should be being confronted with Jesus loving them and Jesus dying on the cross for them, and their need for the gospel and understanding what sin is, and understanding who God is and worshiping Him, listening to Christian music in the car while you're driving, or whatever the case may be. And so there is much more opportunity. One, for them just to be impacted by Christianity. There's going to be rules that maybe a family who doesn't know Jesus, you're going to have rules that they don't have. There's going to be expectations of your kids, or there's going to be things that your kids can't do that other kids can, and not in a bad sense, but because righteousness is going to protect them from sin. But two, it gives them an opportunity to hear the gospel. Look, my kids have all started asking questions somewhere between the ages of 7 and 8 years old, 6, 7, 8, and have placed their faith and trust in Jesus somewhere around 8, 9, 10. I know that's a big gap, but it's because they're in church multiple times a week. We talk about Jesus at our home. They grew up listening to Bible stories being read to them. It's just been a part of their life. And so when you're adding up opportunities to hear the gospel and to make a response in faith, hundreds of thousands, probably, by the time that they've hit that 9, 10-year-old. As many times it's been talked about. Maybe not hundreds of thousands, but thousands upon thousands, tens upon thousands. Well, you take a family who is lost. They don't go to church. They don't talk about Jesus. Maybe at Christmas, maybe at Easter. That kid or the kids in that family, their understanding of Jesus is limited. Their opportunity to hear about Jesus and to make a response in faith is limited. And doesn't mean that they're beyond saving. It doesn't mean that they can't get saved. It doesn't mean that one-time hearing isn't going to be enough. But man, when you look at the opportunities of the believing family versus the opportunities of the unbelieving family, my kids get more opportunities to hear the gospel. And because of the rules set in our family, striving to honor and glorify God, it's shaping who they are, even if they have not yet accepted Christ. So that's what he's talking about there. You stay married in part because you have the opportunity to have influence. You have the opportunity to hopefully point them to Christ and hopefully see them accept Christ, spouse and children. So Paul goes on. But, verse 15, here's where we get one of the biblical excuses or allowances for divorce. But if the unbelieving partner separates, not the believing partner, the unbelieving partner, if they leave, let them be so, or let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. If they want to leave, if they want to get divorced, you can't force them to stay married to you. And if they leave and get divorced, you're not enslaved. I believe that gives you the freedom to remarry, just like if you divorce because of marital unfaithfulness on the part of your partner. I believe that gives you the right to remarry. I think if it's a biblical divorce, biblical remarriage is a thing. Might not all agree with me, but I think that's what the Bible teaches. Anyways, if they leave, in such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? What Paul is saying there is, look, you can fight for that marriage and you can try to force it. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't fight for it, but you don't have to feel obligated to it if they choose to leave, because there's no guarantee that if you force this marriage with a person who doesn't want to be there, that they're going to become Christians, that they're going to be saved. So it's not an excuse for an unbelieving, or for the believing spouse to leave, But if the unbelieving spouse chooses to leave, not that you give up on your marriage, not that you just say, oh, okay, well, I don't love you anymore, or whatever. But if they choose to leave, you can't force them to be married to you. And so there's freedom there. So if you find yourself unequally yoked to an unbeliever as a Christian, stay married. Love them, point them to Jesus, encourage them to know Jesus, talk about the gospel, talk about Jesus with them, pray for them, and hope and pray that God will work in their heart and their life. Being married to an unbeliever is not an excuse to end your marriage, not biblically. The only two biblical opportunities or allowances for divorce are if the unbeliever leaves and marital unfaithfulness, which I believe is really pointing towards repetitious marital unfaithfulness, not a one-time thing. So what about other relationships? What if we find ourselves in a friendship that is unequally yoked? What do we do then? Maybe our best friend that we've been friends with since high school or elementary school, but they don't know Jesus and our lifestyles are totally different. Maybe they shouldn't be your best friend. I know that's hard. Maybe that sounds cold, and maybe that's well, you don't understand what we've been through, and you don't understand. I get it. I get it. There are bonds there. Look, that's one of the reasons why this commandment is given, is because as human beings we can form bonds with people that we don't need bonds formed with. You can, if you're single, there are people that you can like and love and fall in love with, that perfect guy, that perfect girl, and they don't know Jesus. You can still love them. You can still, it is possible to still have those emotional ties and connections. But man, that's not who you need to date or marry if they don't know Jesus, because you're getting unequally yoked. In the same way, man, you can build friendships, and this is a person you'll say they love me and they care about me, and they probably do. But if they're not encouraging you to love and follow Jesus, I'm not saying don't be their friend anymore. I'm just saying that maybe they don't need to be your best friend if they're having impact and influence on you towards unrighteousness or towards sin versus towards Jesus. And so maybe there's some friendships that need to be cut out. Maybe there's some friendships that need to be lessened. And look, I know when you're an adult, it's harder to make friends with other adults. It's easier to be friends with the people that you were friends with growing up or that you've always been friends with. But if our friends are leading us not towards God, but away from Him, sometimes you got to set boundaries. And sometimes you've got to put God first and say He takes precedence. And if it means loving God and following God, if that means I've got to limit this friendship, then maybe we got to limit that friendship. And if it's a business relationship, maybe you've got to find a way out of that business, especially if your business partner is making decisions that are unethical or unbiblical or sinful or illegal. Our relationships they impact us. Anytime you have a relationship with someone, you are yoked together with them. And so, if you're the stronger one and you can impact and influence, great. But if the impact and influence is becoming too strong the other way, then you got to figure something out. And you got to do something. As Christians, we want to have relationships with unbelievers because we want to impact people for the gospel and for the kingdom of God. But when people start impacting us, that's something that we have to be aware of so that we don't get pulled away from Him, so that we don't love Him less, so that we don't follow Him less because of somebody else and their impact and influence in our life. And so I know that's hard. I know that's difficult. I get it. But God comes first. Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love others as yourself. And so if we're going to love God first, then He's got to be the most important relationship in our life. And if people are impacting us or pulling us away from that relationship, then we need to have the love for God, the love for someone else. If we're encouraging them in sin and joining them in sin, then that's not loving them. To do the hard things, to put Him first. So that'll be it for this week. Remember to share, tell other people, share the link on social media. If you like it, if you think it's beneficial, let's spread it so other people can join in. If you have any questions, email them to farmsteadextra@gmail.com, and then we'll be back next week. See you.